Hello, I'm Mark Payne. Welcome to History Alive. History Alive is a program of the West Virginia Humanities Council that brings historical figures to life through portrayals by presenters who have conducted thorough research into their character. These presentations are both entertaining and educational. The Humanities Council makes these characters available to nonprofit organizations across West Virginia such as schools, libraries, historical societies, and a wide range of civic groups. Their presentation fee is paid by the Council, and we ask only that their travel costs be covered by the host group. History Live is designed as an interactive experience between the character and the audience. We encourage your organization or school to host a presentation and bring a figure from history for a visit with your audience or students. Having someone like Booker T. Washington or Ann Bailey come to speak to your group can breathe life into these historical figures and make them more real. Nothing compares to the live in-person visit. Each presentation consists of 3 parts: a monologue, a question-answer session with the character, and then the presenter breaks character to answer questions about how he or she conducted their research. The 15 presenters on our History Live roster have researched a variety of sources such as diaries, journals, letters, official documents, autobiographies, and the research of other scholars in developing their character. A History Live presentation is not a play. It is very much an audience participation event that relies on interaction between the audience and the character. Being able to ask your own questions of these important figures from the past is a unique experience. It's difficult to reproduce the feel of an actual History Live presentation here in the studio. Without an audience to ask questions, we'll change the format a little bit and have our guests sit with me for a few questions after the monologue. But we hope to give a sample of how a History Live presentation can add to the offerings at your school or organization. There will be information on the screen at the end of this program for how to contact the Humanities Council about bringing a History Live character to your community. At this time, I would like to welcome today's guest from history. We are pleased to have with us in the studio Louisa May Alcott.
I was out in my garden the other day, just pruning, doing a few things, tidying up for the winter, and I heard a sound. It was a familiar sound. The sound of little girls giggling. I looked up on the wall, and there they were, 2 of them, watching me. And then I heard one of them, as she sort of elbowed her friend, she said, "No, that can't be her. Jo is small and pretty." Jo March, a character in a book, entirely fictitious, but based on me. The book is, of course, Little Women. Now, ever since I wrote that book, I've had this sort of identity crisis, I guess you would say, to the point that I'm not even sure what is true of Jo March and what is true of Louisa May Alcott. So today, I would like to try, if possible, not to talk about Jo March, because obviously you can buy my book and read about her. Today, I would like to talk about Louisa May and the Alcott family, because I am more proud of the small role that my family and I have played in the anti-slavery movement than I am of any book I've written or any book I ever will write. I became an abolitionist at the age of 3. My father, Bronson Alcott, took me to visit a man named William Lloyd Garrison. Now, at the time, Mr. Garrison was in jail. You see, he'd been standing in a hall giving a talk to the women's anti-slavery movement when the doors at the back of the room burst open and a mob came in, tied a rope around his waist, and drug him through the streets of Boston. Pretty soon the mob had grown to 300 people. Now, the mayor of Boston did not have a jail big enough to house 300 people, so he put Mr. Garrison in jail for his own protection. And that's where Father took me with some food to visit him, and it made a lasting impression on me. Now, the problems faced by those of the Negro race also came home to me in a very personal way when my father admitted a young girl named Susanna Robinson to his school. Father ran a very progressive school in Boston, and all of the best Boston families sent their children there. Well, when Susanna Robinson, who was a Negro, was admitted to the school, all of those families took their children out. And Father was left without a job, any way to support his family. But fortunately, he had good friends. And one of his best friends was a man by the name of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Now, Mr. Emerson found us a house to live in Concord and probably paid the rent, too. And it was there that I mostly grew up. Now, Concord suited me. I was the tomboy of the family, and I love having these open meadows where I could run and trees that I could climb. And I loved the sort of family and friends that gathered around us there and helped raise us. It was there that I started to school. It was a small private school taught by two brothers, John and Henry David Thoreau. Now, John tried to teach me mathematics, which I don't think really ever quite took, but Henry David Thoreau taught me about nature. And he taught me about writing, too, because he would take us through these walks in the woods, and he would point things out to us. And I remember once he saw a spider web, and he said, "Look, it's a handkerchief dropped by a fairy." Well, in Concord, we were able to do all kinds of wonderful things growing up. We had theatricals, plays written by me mostly and directed by me. My sisters would, of course, play the young heroines. I liked the crotchety old aunts, or better yet, the dashing villains that were always tying someone to the tracks. Well, this life in Concord couldn't really last forever because Father couldn't find a job, and, well, we were oftentimes relying on our friends and family. I remember Mr. Emerson used to come over, and he would lean against the mantel while he talked to Mother and Father. And after he left, I'd watch my mother, and she would go over and take the money that he had discreetly left there for us. Well, Mother got a job in Boston, and we moved there. My mother was running an employment agency for young Irish immigrant girls and finding them jobs as domestics largely. And one day a man walked into Mother's office, which was in our home, and said, "I have a different kind of job." He said, "This is not a job for just anyone. It needs to be a lady to read to and take care of my lovely mother who's ill. And there will be no hard work, just taking care of her basic needs, and there's a beautiful home with a wonderful library, and whoever takes the job can have free access to it." Well, when she left, I turned to my mother, or he left rather, and I said to Mother, "I know the perfect person for that job." And she said, "Well, who?" And I said, "Me, of course." Well, Mother didn't think so. You see, my mother is a May, and I don't know if you're familiar with the Mays of Boston, but you see, my grandfather was a colonel in the Revolutionary War, and I'm sure you've heard of John Hancock. Well, he was married to my aunt. And so my mother did not think that it would do for me to hire myself out as a domestic. But I reminded her, I said, "Mother, I am an Alcott, and no honest work is beneath our dignity." So I accepted the position. Now, I wish I could tell you that it was everything that the man described, but, of course, it was not. First of all, there was the matter of his mother. She was the grouchiest old woman I've ever met in my life, and nothing I did was right. I did, in fact, have to do hard work along with everyone else, which I'm no stranger to. The library, well, there was a lock on the door, and I was never allowed in. Now, all of these things I could have tolerated except for one other thing, and that was the gentleman himself. He followed me around everywhere. I was a young girl of 19, and, well, he kept reading to me the poetry that he wrote, and, well, quite frankly, he wrote very bad verse. And each day, these poems became, well, increasingly more personal. I guess you would call them love poems. One day I was sort of up to my elbows in soap suds, and I threw up my hands because he was spouting this fool verse at me, and I said, "I was not hired to listen to you spout fool verse." Well, what do you think he did? Dismissed me? No, that would have been kind. He came in the next day, and he brought me his boots to clean. He had just walked through the stables. Well, the following day, after I had cleaned them and returned to him, he returned them to me in exactly the same condition. And so it was at that time that I turned in my notice that I would work the month that I agreed to, but not a day longer. I'd find him to get my pay envelope, and when I got home and opened it up, I discovered that for 4 weeks' work, he had paid me a grand total of $5. Now, I want you to know that even in 1850, that was an insult. Oh, and my mother, she was so insulted, she sent the money back. So at that point, I had worked for 4 weeks and I had absolutely nothing to show for it. So I did what I often do to sort of make the best of a bad situation. I sat down, I picked up my pen, and I wrote about it. And I wrote this story and I called it How I Went Out to Service. And I thought, if I can get this published in a magazine, I can make some money off of this. Well, I went down to the office of the Atlantic Monthly, the best magazine, why not start at the top, which was over the old corner bookstore there in Boston. And I climbed the stairs of the old corner bookstore, knowing full well that young ladies did not usually go there. It was a place where all the literary lions of the day, gentlemen of course, liked to congregate and swap stories. Well, I sat and waited until all the gentlemen had filed out, and then Mr. Fields invited me in, and he started reading my story, and I told him about my background, how I had done all kinds of work, from being a domestic to being a teacher to taking in laundry, but that I had always wanted to be a writer. Well, he finishes reading this story, and he hands it back to me, and he said, "You're a teacher, I believe you said, Miss Alcott." I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, stick to your teaching. You will never make a writer. You will never make a writer." All the way home, I heard those words echoing in my ears, and you know, I almost believed the man. I almost decided to give up my dream. But then I said, no, I will work harder, and I will learn to write better. And someday, Mr. Fields will publish my stories in his magazine. Well, I want you to know that 8 years later, he did publish a story by Louisa Alcott, and he paid me $50 for it. And confidentially, now he will publish anything I sent him, and I can name my price. And in fact, I have sent him some stories that he earlier rejected. Well, while I was struggling to become a writer, the country was going through a very important struggle over the issue of slavery. And one spring day, my father sent me a letter, and he said, "Louisa May, you need to get to Concord to hear this man speak." Well, I came, and I sat in the town hall while this very, very powerful figure stood in front of me with these steely gray eyes and told us how he was going to find some way to arm the slaves so that they could overthrow their masters. And at the end of the evening, he passed around a hat, and if I'd had any money, I would have given it to John Brown. Well, a few months later, we heard about his daring raid at Harper's Ferry, and how he was caught and being held to stand trial for treason. Treason. In my mind, slavery is the biggest treason this country has ever participated in, and that anything one can do to end it is justified. Now, history, of course, will have to judge John Brown for itself, but I want you to know, on the day that they hung him, we held a memorial service in my hometown of Concord. And Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson spoke eloquently about him. And I was asked to read a poem that I wrote. I can remember a little bit of it, and I will recite it for you. "Then blossomed forth a grander flower in the wilderness of wrong, a soul untouched by slavery's bitter frost, a soul devout and strong. No monument of quarried stone nor eloquence of speech will grave the lessons on the land his martyrdom will teach." Well, when the Civil War broke out, I stood in the streets of my town in Concord, Massachusetts, and I waved the banners and I cheered because I thought, this will be a short, glorious war. All my childhood friends are marching off to war, and I wish I could go with them. If only I was a boy. Well, then I heard that they were looking for nurses, and I signed up just as soon as I could. They sent me to a hospital in Georgetown, right outside of Washington, D.C. The Battle of Fredericksburg had just taken place, and the wounded began to pour in. My job was to bathe the soldiers and then help the doctors with surgeries, amputations mostly. There was one gentleman, a blacksmith from Virginia, John Sully. Now, he might have been from West Virginia, it wasn't a state as yet, but he was dying. Everyone knew that. He had taken a musket ball that had pierced his lungs and had lodged there in his rib cage, and I stayed with him until he died. I got sick myself, and Father came for me, and I went home, where I spent 2 months recovering. And when I could, I sat down and I picked up my pen and I wrote about it. And it was this story that brought a gentleman to see me with a proposal. Not a proposal of marriage. Instead, he wanted me to write a story about the American family, about girls. But I didn't know if I could do that, but I decided to go ahead and give it a try. And within, 4 weeks' time, I had put out Little Women Part 1. Well, I read it. I wasn't sure it was very good, and I sent it off to the publisher, and he wasn't sure either, but he had some little girls read it, and fortunately, they loved it. And that book, well, that book has changed my life. I have become, I guess you would say, rich, which is fine. I have no quarrel with that. And famous, which I'm not so sure about sometimes. It's a kind of blessing and a curse. Now, the blessing part I'd like to talk about a little bit. You see, just a few weeks ago, I visited a college, Vassar College, a college for girls. Now, Vassar College didn't exist when I was growing up. I never got the chance to go to college, but one by one, these little girls, not so little anymore, would come up to me and shake my hand, and they said, "Do you know why I'm in college?" And I said, "No, why?" And they said, "Jo March, you created a character, a girl who could do anything, who could be anything, and I wanted to be like her." And so it is my hope that years from now, when nobody remembers Louisa May Alcott, that they will remember Jo March, and that generations of girls will grow up knowing, believing that they can do anything, that they can be anything.
We're here with Louisa May Alcott, and Miss Alcott, I'd like to welcome you here and thank you for taking time out of what I know is a busy schedule to be with us today.
Well, thank you.
You're certainly, I think, best known for being the author of Little Women.
Right.
But I wanted to ask you, what do you believe is your best work?
Well, I think Little Women is a very good work, particularly given that I wrote it very quickly. After I had written Part 1, I thought I could write Part 2 in a very short period of time because I knew all the characters, but I kept getting interrupted by these letters from little girls, all wanting to dictate how it should end, and particularly who Jo should marry. But I had never really intended for her to marry anyone. I intended for her to be like I am, a literary spinster, but my publisher said that that wouldn't do, so I created the character of the professor for her. And so I guess because Little Women was my first really great success, it has a special place in my heart, and I think it is better than Little Men and some of the other books that followed. I also have written some books for adults, including one called Moods, which I think was the one that I feel the closest to, although it definitely got very mixed reviews.
Why do you feel closest to Moods?
I wrote it not because a publisher wanted it. I wrote it because I needed to read it, or to write it. Mm-hmm. It was just burning in me.
Well, so what are you working on now?
Well, since Little Women came out, I'm sort of mostly writing things that my publishers ask for. So I'm working on Jo's Boys, which is the final story in the Little Women saga. And I hope that after I have finished that I will be able to turn to something for adults again.
Well, you know, there are rumors going around that you may have been a secret scribbler of lurid tales. Did you ever publish anything under assumed names?
Oh, well, I don't know how you happen to hear that, but
I have my sources.
I see. Well, since you already know this, I think I could tell you that, in fact, a lot of people suspect that I did because Jo March did in Little Women. I did write for a period of time under the name A.M. Bernard. And these are stories, I call them blood and thunder tales. Stories of strong women heroines who manipulate men and get them to marry them, actresses who pretend to be younger than they are. There's all kinds of things in them that you'll never see in Little Women. And I love writing them, I confess, and I miss it dreadfully. But it did pay the rent for a long time, and I did it under an assumed name so that my father and Mr. Emerson and those people wouldn't know.
Well, I know that you've always been a supporter of getting the right to vote for women, and you've heard people like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton. Some of these folks have accused you of not really doing enough to support that cause, and I'm curious if you would be interested to respond to that.
Yes, I have responded to that in letters that I've written to various journals, because I want to make it clear that nothing could be further from the truth. I intend to go forward as far and as fast as the prejudice of the world will allow on what I consider to be the most significant issue of our time, now that slavery has been abolished. I can't do what Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony do, go around the country and give speeches. So my health doesn't permit it, for one thing, and I'm busy writing. So I work locally on voting issues, and I also think that by my writing I create characters of strong little girls, strong women that could perhaps help serve as a role model in the future, and will make change that way.
And in fact, didn't I hear that you have actually gone to the polls and voted?
Yes, I'm very proud of that, actually. In Concord, where I live, which is a very progressive community, they passed an ordinance that said that women could vote in school board elections provided they owned property. Well, I own property, and so I decided that I would vote, and I went down and I was the first to register to vote. And when I got there, they said, well, did you bring proof that you'd paid your property taxes? Well, I didn't know that I had to, so I went ahead and I wrote out a check, and so that year I paid my property taxes early. And I paid them gladly, and I'll tell you that has never happened before. Well, I asked for a list of all the other women who could vote. How many were there? And there were about 125. And so I sort of made it my own mission to try and get as many of them to register to vote as I could. And so I went and had these little teas and called on them. Well, you would not believe the excuses they made. They said, oh, it's berry picking time, I'll be busy putting up jam, or you have to go to the town hall to vote, and I wouldn't be able to feed my husband and get the dinner dishes done up in time. And I said, I don't think that it would significantly harm the lords of creation and their digestive systems if just this once they had a cold dinner. And besides, I know these same women will leave the dirty dishes on the table if they're going to a quilting bee or something like that. Well, I got about 29 to register, and about 25 showed up that night. And my father, bless his heart, stood up and said, I move that the women be allowed to vote first, because they've been waiting so long. And so I was the first woman to cast her vote, and lightning did not strike me dead. The town of Concord was not swallowed up by an earthquake, and we all voted. And then the judge stood up and he said, I move that the polls be closed. Well, there was a big uproar. Everyone laughed, but it passed. And so in 1880, in a school board election in Concord, Massachusetts, only the women voted. And I dare say that's probably the only time in history that that's happened.
Well, that's certainly something to be proud of. And now I would like to introduce the presenter of Louisa May Alcott, who is actually Arla Ralston of Charleston. And Arla is a member of our History Alive roster, and certainly appreciate you being here today, Arla, in full regalia there. And but I want to ask you what I always ask our guests here, which is why Louisa May? You know, why this character? What interested you, and how did you go about researching her?
Well, I chose Louisa May Alcott. I read the book Little Women and the other books when I was a little girl, and I loved them. And then when I began looking at Louisa May Alcott's life, I was just astonished, actually, by all of the people that she knew and the things she participated in. I just can't think of anybody who was more involved in her time than Louisa May, from growing up with the Transcendentalists to working in the anti-slavery movement, being a nurse during the Civil War, then turning around and working for the suffrage movement, and meeting John Brown, Harriet Tubman, all of these people that are history. She knew.
Yeah, she was right in the thick of it. Let me ask you this. I asked Louisa May what she thought her best work was. Do you have any thoughts on what you think some of her best works were?
Well, I think just in terms of writing, that Little Women probably is her best work. I think that she got, after Little Women, sort of trapped into this writing for children thing, and it wasn't really what she necessarily wanted to do. It's interesting when you asked about researching her. One of the things when you research her you find is that it's kind of hard to get at the real Louisa May. And she had kept journals, but she destroyed them. And so she only had little notes. And but the one way that you can really get at her character is that people kept her letters. And so the published letters that she wrote to other people really reveal. And one of the things she said over and over again were things like, turned out more moral pap for the young. And she was really very pithy and had a very sharp tongue, but she cultivated in a very modern way this image of a children's writer. And she was a writing machine.
Really? And
just turned things out. In fact, she got to the point where her right thumb got injured from writing. She taught herself to write with her left hand so she could switch off and just write.
Wow.
A lot of her stuff was kind of disappointing after Little Women.
Really? Was it disappointing to her, you think? Or
to me.
That's your, okay.
Yeah, and I think to her too, to some extent.
Yeah.
I think she would have always kept talking about how she wanted to get a chance after she finished the saga of the March family to write a book for adults, and never did.
What were the circumstances around her death? Where was she, and how did she die? When did
she was living in Boston, and she had been ill for some time. When she was a nurse in the Civil War, they treated her with this medication called calomel, which contains mercury, and she had mercury poisoning, and that probably shortened her life considerably. So she was about 56 years old. Her father was still alive. She went to visit him because he was sick, and he was not doing well, and she visited him, and she left her coat there. And it was a warm day. She caught a chill, and that night she sort of fell into a coma and died without knowing that he had died. And when people came to his funeral, they were told that Louisa May had died as well. They're both buried in Concord, and on her little tombstone it just says LMA.
Well, Arla, again, I want to thank you for being here. Arla is one of the very talented people that we're lucky to have on our History Live roster that travels all over the state. And actually, I know you travel certainly outside the boundaries of West Virginia in doing multiple characters. But today, you were here with us as Miss Alcott. So I want to thank you folks for being here and for watching History Alive.